Hi there, this is John for KillerPHP.com, and today what I'm going to be doing is looking at how we can create anonymous functions in PHP 5.3 and soon to be PHP 6. So lately what we've been doing is we've been building this very simple MVC application from scratch, and so I'm just going to open some of the classes that we've been working on. To begin with, we have a public folder with an index.php file, which I'm just going to open up right here. And you can just grab this source code and follow along if you want to just look at inner or anonymous functions. But basically, we've defined a namespace for our controllers to live in, which is com killerphp controllers controller. We've got a URL, which we are then getting the prefix, the controller, and the action name, and then based on that we are essentially creating different controller objects and then dispatching them down here. So you can see that we have an index controller and we have a test controller that are being defined just down here. And all we're doing is we're passing in the controller name and the action name. And this is not intended to be a, how to build your own MVC web application structure so that you can roll your own, but rather so that you can see how they work. And when you do pick an MVC architecture, you'll have some semblance of how the underpinnings of it function. So we have that in our index.php file, and you'll notice that it's loading these two different controllers. I'm just going to load the index controller. And what you can see is that it's inheriting from a controller abstract class. Also, we are defining a namespace here. And then we have this default action and welcome action, and they're both running this render. So this render you'll see is a function, but it's not actually defined in this class. So it must be in controller abstract. So I'm going to open controller abstract now. And we can see the controller abstract implements an interface called iController. We'll look at that in a minute, but we basically did this in the last video. We created a function to get the folder in which we want to render a view in, and that's based on the namespace. We also created a render function, which you've already seen this before. This is include once. Basically, it's loading a file, and this is based on getting the view folder and then concatenating that with the action name .php. And then the last thing that we've created is this dispatch method, which basically dynamically picks a function name, appends the word action, checks to see if that function exists in this class, and then runs this method, whatever this method is. So this is all happening dynamically. And what that means at the end of the day is that if I want to create in my index controller here a public function called learn PHP action, and then I run this render, and even that is kind of repetitive. There's ways around that, but for now that's fine. So let's say I create this learn PHP action over here, and I go back to my file system. This is my own file system, and then if I go to sites, killer PHP, which is what we're looking at, and if I go to com killer PHP and then views and then index, which is the corresponding index controller, and let's say I'm just going to copy and paste this file for now. I'll rename this to learn php.php, and I'm going to open this in BBEdit, my text editor. And then here I'll change the h1 to learn PHP at killerphp.com. And here I'll just put learn php.php. So if I go back to my web browser here and I go to index/learn PHP, then I'm going to get learn PHP at killerphp.com. And so we've basically created all of this architecture very quickly. That means that it's very easy to flesh out new pages that have a very good structure to them. And we can create different templates for different pages, and it's all organized in a really really elegant manner. Now, earlier on in this set, we also looked at models. So the last thing that we need to look at is how we can take the models, the data that we're storing, and push it up to the view. And that's going to be happening, in our case, in our controller object, since we're still dealing with very simple sites. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is look a little bit at how the two are going to be linked together. And so for now, what I want to start with is just creating a user in the welcome action. So actually, we're just going to open this up a bit. And here I'm going to create a user, which will be a new com killer PHP models user. So I'm creating a new user object that's coming from the killer PHP models namespace. And this is really handy because it might end up being that you'll have different models and different namespaces. And if you're working on a larger project, there's a good chance that one namespace might actually conflict with another. So this is only happening in the killer PHP namespace. So if we had another MVC framework, then the two wouldn't collide. So I'm just going to go back to my web browser here, and I'm going to go to index/welcome, which is where we're currently working. And it says missing one argument for com user construct called here. So let's just review and go back to the user object here and see what's going on. So if I go to com killer PHP models user, you can see that the constructor requires that I put in a first name, a last name, and an address. So let's do that. So here I'm going to put in John Smith and 90210 Beverly Hills. I don't know. Just first thing that came to mind. So if I refresh this again, nothing should happen. You'll notice that I've created this user object, but it's not interfering with the view at all. Here we're simply interested in the controller and the functionality of the controller. So this user object can easily be outputted to the view, and I'll show you how that can happen. So let's say on the welcome page, I want John Smith to be shown in the view. Well, in my welcome action, I can very easily, I'm just going to open it up here. If I go to views, index, welcome.php, under welcome to my killer PHP application, I can create a new header 2, and I'm going to put in PHP echo this name. And I'm just going to close that PHP tag, and then I'm going to put in welcome, comma, and then an exclamation mark. So here, this is a very interesting concept. What we're looking at here is a way of separating out the view from the controller. So the view doesn't know what this name is. It doesn't know where it's coming from. It doesn't know who this person is. It's simply interested in outputting this name. Now in my index controller, I can make this name whatever I want, and this would be considered a business rule. So I can say that this name is equal to user get first name. And let's save that. If I go back to Firefox, then I'm going to get welcome John. If I say this name is user get first name concatenated with a space and then user get last name, then that's also okay. Then I'll get welcome John Smith. So you can see that there's a complete separation between what the view is concerned with and what the controller is concerned with. Lastly, because we've already implemented a toString method, I could simply move user into this name and pass the responsibility of rendering up to the model. Because if we go to the user object here, we can see that we've already defined a toString method. So I'll get welcome John Smith lives at 90210 Beverly Hills. Now, this is not considered a very good practice because the model should only be interested in the data, not its rendering of the data. So let's say we wanted to pass a render script from the controller to the model. Let's say we wanted to have the way something is rendered and the data separated. Now, there's a lot of different ways of doing that, and one of them is called the observer pattern. And the observer pattern is used quite frequently in MVC applications. However, I'm going to show you another way of doing it first, which is a little more interesting, and some would argue that it allows you greater flexibility in terms of your architecture because you're actually passing functions around instead of parameters or data. Now, to illustrate this, we're going to be going and implementing a special function in our user object. So as a starting point for this whole idea that we're going to be passing functions around, as a way of illustrating this, to begin with, I'm going to be creating a new function here called, and it'll be a public function, and it'll be called render with. And it'll take in a callback. And then what I'll do is I'm going to basically say that because the model knows what the various parameters are, it should be the one in charge of rendering something with data. So we've got address, we've got first name, we've got last name. So what I want to do is I want to basically say that instead of my toString method just taking in, this first name, this last name, lives at, and then this address, let's say we wanted to make the lives at a little more dynamic. So what I could do is I could have an output variable, which will just be a string. And then what the output variable will do is it will concatenate with this dot and equals with whatever the callback function is. So I'm going to say callback this first name, and then output callback this last name, and then output callback this email, or actually rather we'll start with address because we're sticking with that. And then it'll return the output. Now, normally in traditional PHP or PHP before 5.3, you wouldn't be able to do something like this, where you have a variable that is actually a function. So now this function with this callback is going to have to be defined somewhere. And we're going to actually do that definition, or we're going to build that definition in the controller. So if I go back to the index controller here, I can say that this name is going to equal, let's go back here, render with. So it will be user render with, and now instead of passing in data, I'm going to be passing in a function. So I'm going to say function. We're going to open that up. So you can see that basically all we're doing is we're saying that we want to define a function actually we need to define an argument as well. So the function is going to take in a string, and this string is going to be first name, last name, and email, and it will return a space, and then let's say a strong tag. And we'll just put the string inside the strong tag. So what's going to happen? Well, basically, this function here is being defined inside of render with as a parameter or as an argument. And then render with is going to take that function and it's going to pass it to the user object, and it's going to take this and it's going to run it through first name, last name, and address. So if I go back to Firefox and I refresh this, I'm going to see welcome John Smith 90210 Beverly Hills exclamation mark. Well, what's even more interesting is that the callback function is putting strong tags around all of our elements, which is great. So we can see that the callback is functioning correctly. Now, what if we wanted to do something a little more interesting? If, for example, we had a function that was defined in the view that could be rendering a list, for example. So that's what we're going to do next. So this one just puts strong tags around things, which isn't very interesting. But what would be even better would be if I could render something with a set of parameters. So I'm going to collect up all the parameters, and because we're dealing with an object, we can already get all the parameters as an array. So I'll just say params equals, and we'll delete this for now. Let's start there. Okay. An array, and it'll have an address, and we'll define that as this address. And then we'll have first name. Actually, let's just do address and name. And then here we'll, we'll just keep this simple. So first name, this first name, and then last name. And its value is going to be this last name. So we're basically defining a key value pair where address corresponds with this address, first name corresponds with this first name, last name corresponds with this last name. And then here, I'm going to say that the output is going to equal the callback with the params. Now I can define the whole rendering structure in another class. In this case, it's going to be the index controller. So what's happening is the actual rendering code doesn't live in the model, it still lives in an upper layer, but the data code is living in a lower layer. And that's kind of the idea, is that we're separating one thing from another. So here, instead of putting in this anonymous function, or this closure, as a string, we're going to take in a collection of parameters. And I'll just call them results. Just clean this up. Okay, so we've got a function, and it's going to take in results, and the output is going to start with a definition list. And then for each results as key and result, we'll say that the output is going to concatenate a definition title with the key, and it's going to concatenate a data definition as the result. And lastly, it will return this output concatenated with a closing tag for the definition list. So this is just the function, and we're passing this function into the render with method. Let's see what happens. Actually, before we do that, we should also go back to our welcome.php, and now we don't want to stick a definition list inside a header 2, because that's not going to work. Well, it's just not a good practice. So we'll just say php echo this name. I'll refresh this again, and I'm going to get address, first name, last name, and it's all there. And basically, we're passing something down to the model from the controller. The model is running a function that it doesn't know what that function is, and then it's passing the result back up to the controller. The controller is then passing that to the view, and then the view is rendering it. So something that you can also try is some hosting providers have short tags enabled, and you can even replace the question mark PHP with just an equal sign. And then you get something like this. And now name isn't a very good listing of what this is, so we'll just say user. And I'm going to change this parameter. Instead of it being this name, it'll be this user, which should not be confused with the user object. This is an object, and this is a string. So that's a very quick look at how we can, 2 examples that are using anonymous functions. Now in the next tutorial, we're going to be looking at how we can incorporate session into this and how we can start building out a form. Thanks for listening.